presentation will cover transgender history and current transgender issues in the United States as it relates to social psychology. The term transgender is known to most, but its definition can be confusing to some. The best way to define it for the purpose of Transgender 101 is to say that transgender is an umbrella term that describes many people who transcend normative embodiments of masculine and feminine, including transsexuals, crossdressers, drag queens, and kings, genderqueers, and other gender-variant people. Most misuse transgender synonymously with transsexual, which identifies people whose gender identity conflicts with their ascribed gender, and they may take hormones and/or undergo surgery. This quote is from the sociology journal Teaching Sociology from an article called Teaching Transgender by Trey Wentling, Kristen Schilt, Elroy J. Windsor, and Betsy Lucal. For the purpose of this presentation, transgender will be used with this accompanying definition. In pre-Columbian times, many native tribes in what is now the United States recognized genders outside of the male-female binary. Even for those who did fall into either male or female category had different gender roles than Europeans were used to, such as politically involved women. While it is important to know that these ideologies existed, American society as we know it today is a result of the proliferation of European ideology. This is arguably the greatest influence on transgender issues today, so the history will begin with the Victorian era in the 1800s, and will cover key points in America's history that relate to transgender issues. Many more events and people have influenced the term as we know it today, more than can be covered in this presentation. American society has its roots in England, where the male-female gender binary was clear both socially and legally. Example is common laws regarding coverture. Coverture is the laws that stated that when a woman is married, she loses all of her rights to an individual, or all of her rights as an individual. Those rights were covered by those of her husband. Industrialization caused men and women to be further separated into public and private spheres, respectively. The combination of the industrialization of America and the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species further separated men and women into two spheres, the public and private. This separation was especially apparent in middle and upper-class white society, in which true women were supposed to stay in the private sphere at home, and whose activities were generally limited to reading, especially the Bible and other religious texts, and raising children. Men were active in the public sphere, business and politics, and increasingly told to participate in sports in order to remain masculine. Science began to categorize those who did not fit gender norms as inverted. Science began to focus on sexuality at this time, and tended to be harsh towards those who did not fit into the gender roles of the time. Feminine men and masculine women were categorized in medical publications as inverted, which can be considered an umbrella term for anyone acting outside their given gender, including but not limited to homosexuals. This category was studied by psychologists of the time, such as Havelock Ellis, who did many case studies on inverted women, which you can read his publication, The Sexual Perversion of Women, published in 1895, to see exactly how he viewed those he considered inverted. Some inverted men and women were homosexuals, but some simply did not fit the gender norms. The term transgender did not exist at this time, but sexologists such as Richard von Krafft-Ebing studied transsexual people. In the 1920s and 30s, science and medicine continued to be critical of transgender individuals. The term used at this time was transsexual and included those who sought to change their bodies to match the gender with which they identified. The first famous transsexual person in America was Christine Jorgensen, who underwent sex reassignment surgery in Denmark after serving in the United States military during World War II. Jorgensen became famous after her return from Denmark in a subsequent front-page story in the New York Daily News. Her fame allowed her to become an advocate for transsexual individuals. According to Professor Stephen Whittle in an article published on the Guardian's website, her fame was the reason that her psychiatrist in Denmark, Dr. Hamburger, started receiving letters, and in 1953 he published a paper titled The Desire for Change of Sex as shown by personal letters from 465 men and women. Whittle continues by saying that suddenly medical professionals realized that these were not exceptional cases. There was a whole swath of people who were unhappy because their gender role did not match their body. Christine Jorgensen was quoted later in 1982 as saying that she preferred the term transgender as opposed to transsexual. The news article says, Ms. Jorgensen, now 56, said in a speech to Fresno State University students Monday that she describes people who have had such operations as transgender rather than transsexual. Sexuality is who you sleep with, but gender is who you are, she explained. It must be noted that Christine Jorgensen is a positive story of a transgender individual and a rarity because she is able to fit in with the beautiful blonde American girl norm. Others have not been so lucky, and their stories tend to have unhappy endings. Since the 1950s, some states have allowed people to change their gender on birth certificates or their legal status as male or female. Transgender individuals have become more prominent in the media, and science has changed its views on transgender for the most part. In particular, the DSM-4 changed the entry from transsexual to gender identity disorder, but it must be noted that this categorization is only for individuals who are under extreme stress and whose daily functioning is affected by their gender identity dysphoria.
Sex reassignment surgery is a modern option that is burgeoning in frequency for people born with both male and female genitalia, ambiguous genitalia, or a person who does not relate to their assigned sex. It is sometimes performed voluntarily later on in life, and other times conducted soon after birth by the decision of the child's parents. The latter scenario is more often pursued under circumstances where the child is intersexed, hermaphroditism, or ambiguous genitalia are present. Fledgling research in the 1970s in the United States found negative results associated with sexual reassignment surgery, where people who had undergone the procedure reported that they had made a mistake by selecting assignment surgery. During this time period, however, surgical practices and emotional and mental therapeutic techniques were not as well developed, and social acceptance was not as pervasive as it is now. These factors contributed to these numbers that found a strong correlation to negative results associated with enduring the operation. However, research today has discovered that results of sex reassignment surgery are generally either neutral or favorable, given the refining of therapy and surgical procedures to better align an individual's physical sex with their mental sexual identity. An appropriate example that reflects the social conflict that accompanies our society's sexual dimorphism can be easily found within the case of a Canadian child named Bruce in the late 1960s. Bruce's penis was severely injured during a botched circumcision, so the remaining penile tissues were removed by a physician by the name of John Money. He was then raised as a girl by the name of Brenda and was exposed to feminine gender roles to induce a female sexual identity. Despite her parents' attempts to raise her as a girl, Brenda was often teased and rejected by her peers due to her masculine physical features and masculine behavior, which included fighting, refusing to wear dresses, and harboring a desire to play with toys which were socially accepted as being meant for boys. Years later, Brenda became David and endeavored to have a penis and testicles artificially constructed and surgically applied to his body. This story highlights how gender role expectations can have very harmful effects upon an individual's mental and physical welfare. Brenda was raised as a girl, but her tendency toward behaviors that society associates with masculinity and the male sex led to alienation by her peers, which ultimately led to her returning to a gender identity that society deemed consistent with her biological male sex. Gender stereotypes could have played a significant role in guiding Brenda's behavior, as well as the actions of other children who often teased her for the inconsistency between her physical features and gendered behavior. For example, due to her observations, Brenda was under the expressed impression that boys in general have it easier than girls do, and thus provided a salient and potent inspiration to reject her socialization as a girl. Her peers were more aware that her body and aggressive behavior had a more masculine manifestation, something associated generally with boys, which in turn led to conflict due to the fact that she wore feminine clothing, such as dresses, a trait taught to be acceptably practiced by girls. This led to a negative response from her peers, who were also socialized with the point of view of stereotypes that rigidly define behaviors that are normal based on individual sex. This, as can be concluded from this example, leads to both prejudice and discrimination. Social identity theory also provides some insight and explanations in regards to this breed of behavior from both parties involved, both Brenda and the society surrounding her. Social identity theory posits that we, as a species, express a predisposition toward preferring people to who we can most relate. Brenda, relating more to boys who she preferred to be in her in-group, was dealt a significant blow to her self-esteem by failing to be consistent with her in-group's conceived gender norms and stereotypes. Her peers saw her as part of the out-group, someone that they could not identify with, and who violated gender social constructs associated with their own group. People tend to be biased towards members of their own group and be suspicious or even hostile in regards to people within their out-group, thus illustrating the circumstances surrounding the case of gender alienation experienced by Brenda. Rigidly defined gender stereotypes and norms, as well as a lack of exposure to and acceptance of those who do not neatly fall within the polarized spectrum of sexual dimorphism, are culpable in bearing forth the prejudice and discrimination held against transgendered and transsexual individuals.
Current events and transgender in the media. Forward progression. Progression can be seen today both locally and globally towards transgender acceptance. Acceptance of transgender teen in a California high school as homecoming queen. Emphasis on gender neutrality seen globally in growing trends of unisex toys in both preschools and toy stores. Examples of these include Sweden's gender-neutral preschools, doing away with pronouns he and she to address children and instead allowing children to pick toys based on preference. This can also be seen in Toys R Us as a company in Sweden, UK, and Ireland campaigning of Let Toys Be Toys. This campaign organizes by type rather than gender and doing away with gender-specific toys. Transgender in media, the story of Cassidy Lynn Campbell. On September 20th, 2013, Cassidy Lynn Campbell, a transgender teen, was crowned homecoming queen at Marina High School in Huntington Beach, California. This is perhaps a benchmark in American history towards accepting transgender teenagers nationwide. Cassidy Lynn Campbell, a teen who had been taking hormone blockers and estrogen injections since high school to transition, decided to run for homecoming queen not for popularity, but rather to make a statement. When interviewed, she exclaimed, "If I win, it would mean that the school recognizes me as the gender I always felt I was," she told the LA Times. "But with all this attention, I realize it's bigger than me. I'm doing this for the kids who can't be themselves. For me, running for homecoming queen has nothing to do with winning, but rather giving hope to transgender teens around the world." But the road to winning for Cassidy was not easy. Although Cassidy received support from her classmates, many opposed her story initially. Although Cassidy's story holds a shred of hope for the transgender community, it is proof that we're still not have not fully accepted it as a nation. As seen in the growing trends of gender-neutral unisex toys in both preschools and toy stores in Europe, Sweden's gender-neutral preschools uses the word friends to replace pronouns of he and she to regard children. In a preschool in Sweden, doing away with the pronouns him and her and instead replacing them with friends has been used. The point of this is to create a more gender-neutral environment where the children are able to pick their gender based on the toys they enjoy rather than the toys that are designed to be boy or girl. Toys are placed alongside one another, the dolls with the trucks, the tractor next to the pretend kitchen. All items you would see in any other nursery, but deliberately mixed in order to encourage the children to play with whatever he or she desires. Toys R Us, committing to a gender-neutral marketing strategy, has also begun to campaign with Let Toys Be Toys. In this campaign, which hit all UK and Ireland stores, the company implemented the goal of removing all gendered language from their toys and instead promoting both girl and boys playing with the same toys in both advertisements and commercials. The company hopes to promote gender-neutral marketing and said the decision came last year after Toys R Us Sweden similarly progressed, where toys were organized by type rather than gender. Hate crimes in America towards lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. Hate crimes still persist around America towards these peoples. In 2012, we saw the fourth highest murder rate towards these people, as regarded by the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Program polls. This group analyzes the statistics collected in 18 states from the survivors of victims of hate, collecting data such as age, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and type of violence experienced. The overall homicide rate decreased by 16.7% from 2011, which had the highest homicide rate of all time of these peoples. There has been an overall decrease in hate and violence committed crimes against transgender individuals, with a 4% decrease since 2011. However, targets of the violence are most frequently targeted transgender women, especially those of color. Hate crimes in particular directed towards these transgender women can be considered triple jeopardy. Triple jeopardy refers to the unfair disadvantages these people face, often facing discrimination from gender, race, sex, and their sexuality. Unfortunately, these individuals often fall victim to crimes of hate, as they are already targeted and prejudiced against for the various other factors. This report, as well as receiving string of violent hate crimes in New York, is a reminder that violence against the LBGTG community, and particularly marginal groups within the community, is an ongoing problem which is too urgent to ignore. This here shows the statistics. 25% of all documented anti-LBGTG homicides were the fourth highest yearly total ever recorded. 53% were all transgender women, and 73% were people of color.
These are the sources that we used to research transgender issues. Thank you for watching our presentation.